Wednesday, January 17th, 1917, 2:47 in the afternoon. Room 40, Admiralty Building, London. Three men hunched over a desk cluttered with papers covered in blocks of numbers, their faces illuminated by the weak winter light filtering through frosted windows. Outside, the city shivered under a grey sky that had forgotten the meaning of blue. Inside, Captain Reginald Hall, Director of British Naval Intelligence, held in his hands a decoded telegram that would drag an entire hemisphere into the bloodiest war humanity had yet known. He read the words once, then again, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to something approaching disbelief. The message was addressed from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. Its contents proposed an alliance against the United States, promising Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona as rewards. Hall looked up at his colleagues, the weight of what they had intercepted settling over them like fog. They had just discovered Germany's invitation to invade America, and now they had to figure out how to use it without revealing that Britain had been reading everyone's mail for years. What none of them could know in that moment was that this single piece of intercepted communication would accomplish what 2.5 years of submarine warfare, propaganda, and diplomatic pressure had failed to achieve. It would transform the United States from determined neutral to avenging combatant in less than 8 weeks. Act 1. The cipher that changed everything. The story begins not with the telegram itself, but with the invisible war being waged beneath the visible one. While soldiers died in muddy trenches across France and Belgium, another conflict played out in the sterile offices of cryptographers and intelligence officers, fought with codebooks and cables instead of rifles and artillery. By early 1917, the Great War had devolved into a grinding stalemate. Germany and its allies faced Britain, France, Russia, and their associated powers across battle lines that had barely shifted in 2 years. Millions were dead. Economies teetered on the edge of collapse. And across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States watched with mingled horror and relief, protected by 3,000 miles of water and a stubborn determination to avoid European entanglements. President Woodrow Wilson had won re-election just 2 months earlier on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The American public, composed largely of immigrants from the very nations now slaughtering each other, wanted no part in what seemed like an ancient blood feud dressed in modern uniforms. German Americans constituted the largest ethnic minority in the country. Irish Americans harbored deep resentment toward Britain. The notion that the United States would voluntarily step into this charnel house seemed not just unlikely but absurd. Germany's leadership understood this. They counted on it, and in that calculation lay the seed of their most catastrophic miscalculation. Arthur Zimmermann occupied one of the most powerful positions in the German Empire. As State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, he wielded influence over Germany's diplomatic corps and shaped the nation's international strategy. 50 years old in early 1917, Zimmermann had risen through the ranks of the Foreign Office with a reputation for boldness that sometimes crossed into recklessness. He possessed neither the aristocratic pedigree of many of his colleagues nor their cautious instincts. What he did possess was absolute faith in Germany's cause and a willingness to pursue unconventional strategies to achieve victory. In January 1917, facing the possibility of continued stalemate or eventual defeat, Zimmermann crafted a proposal so audacious that it would have seemed like fantasy had it not been committed to paper and transmitted across 2 oceans. The logic behind the Zimmermann telegram emerged from Germany's increasingly desperate strategic position. By the beginning of 1917, the war had become a contest of attrition that Germany was slowly losing. The British naval blockade was starving the German population and crippling its war industries. German submarines provided the only effective counter-weapon, but their use against civilian shipping risked bringing America into the war. Germany's military leadership believed they could win the war through unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any vessel bound for Allied ports without warning. They calculated they could starve Britain into submission within 5 months, before America could mobilize even if it did enter the conflict. But they needed insurance. If America did come in, Germany needed a way to tie down American forces far from the European battlefield. The answer, Zimmermann believed, lay south of the Rio Grande. Mexico in 1917 simmered with revolutionary chaos and anti-American resentment. The Mexican Revolution had been raging since 1910, producing a succession of governments, each more unstable than the last. The United States had intervened repeatedly, most recently in 1916 when General John Pershing led an expedition into northern Mexico hunting the revolutionary leader Pancho Villa. The mission had been a humiliating failure. Villa escaped, Mexican nationalism intensified, and the border region remained tense. Zimmermann saw opportunity in this turmoil. If Mexico could be persuaded to attack the United States, American military resources would be diverted to the south. Even if Mexico ultimately lost, the distraction would buy Germany precious time. And as an additional enticement, Zimmermann proposed bringing Japan, then nominally an allied power but increasingly at odds with the United States over Pacific influence, into the alliance as well. On January 9, 1917, Zimmermann composed his proposal at the Foreign Office in Berlin. The message was brief, clinical in its audacity. It instructed the German ambassador in Washington, Count Johann von Bernstorff, to approach the Mexican government with an offer. If the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico should attack the United States in alliance with Germany. In return, Germany would provide generous financial support and help Mexico recover the territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, lost in the Mexican-American War 70 years earlier. The ambassador was further instructed to suggest that Mexico invite Japan to join this alliance, turning the conflict into a truly global war with fronts on both American coasts and its southern border. The telegram was encrypted using code number 0075, a cipher the Germans believed to be unbreakable. The message was transmitted via multiple routes, a precaution that would prove catastrophically inadequate. One copy went by wireless from the powerful transmitter at Nauen, outside Berlin, to a receiving station in Sayville, Long Island. Another copy travelled via cable through Sweden to Buenos Aires, then north to Washington. And in a supreme irony, a third copy was sent through American diplomatic channels. The United States had allowed Germany to use American telegraph lines for diplomatic communications in an effort to keep peace negotiations alive. Germany used this courtesy to plot an invasion of its host. The message passed through a relay station in London, where it was intercepted by British intelligence. Room 40, the cryptanalysis section of British naval intelligence, went to work. Room 40 had been intercepting and decoding German communications since the early days of the war. The unit's success stemmed from a combination of luck, skill, and German mistakes. In August 1914, the Russian Navy recovered German naval codebooks from the cruiser Magdeburg after it ran aground in the Baltic. The Russians shared the codes with Britain. Later that year, a British trawler retrieved additional codebooks from a destroyed German destroyer. Throughout the war, German telegrams passed through undersea cables that touched British-controlled territory, allowing interception. The cryptographers of Room 40, led by the legendary Sir Alfred Ewing and later by Commander Alastair Denniston, became expert at breaking German codes. By early 1917, they could read much of Germany's diplomatic and naval traffic. But reading the codes and using the intelligence they provided were two different challenges entirely. Captain Reginald Blinker Hall understood this distinction better than anyone. Hall, nicknamed for a facial tic that made him appear to be constantly winking, possessed one of the most devious minds in British intelligence. He knew that the Zimmermann telegram represented a propaganda windfall that could finally bring America into the war. But he also knew that simply presenting the decoded message to the Americans would raise impossible questions. How had Britain obtained it? If Britain admitted to reading German diplomatic communications, it would have to admit to reading American communications as well, since they often travelled the same cables. Germany might change its codes entirely, blinding British intelligence. And most dangerous of all, the Americans might not believe the telegram was genuine. They might suspect British forgery, a propaganda trick to manipulate them into a war they did not want. Hall sat on the telegram for weeks, his mind working through scenarios and possibilities. He needed to find a way to present the evidence that did not reveal Britain's code-breaking capabilities. He needed context that would make the telegram's authenticity undeniable. And he needed to wait for the right moment, when American opinion might be most receptive to evidence of German treachery. While Hall plotted, events moved forward with their own momentum. On January 31st, 1917, Germany announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, effective the following day. All vessels in the war zone around Britain, including neutral ships, would be sunk without warning. It was the gamble Germany's military leadership had been pushing for, the all-or-nothing strategy they believed would win the war. Within days, German submarines sent American ships to the bottom of the Atlantic. American sailors died. Public opinion in the United States shifted, but not as dramatically as the Allies hoped. Many Americans still believed the war was not their fight. Hall made his move in late February. He discovered that the telegram had been re-encoded by Bernstorff in Washington using an older, more vulnerable German code and forwarded to the German embassy in Mexico City. British intelligence had an agent in Mexico who obtained a copy of this second telegram from a corrupt telegraph office employee. This version provided the cover story Hall needed. Britain could claim it had obtained the telegram in Mexico, not through cable interception in London. On February 19, 1917, Hall presented the telegram to Edward Bell, Secretary of the American Embassy in London. Bell read it, recognized its significance, and immediately cabled Washington. But even then, Hall held back the final revelation, waiting to see if Germany would be foolish enough to confirm its own guilt. The telegram reached President Wilson on February 24th. Wilson read it in private, his face growing pale. For 2 years he had struggled to maintain American neutrality while German actions steadily eroded it. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, which killed nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans, had brought the countries to the brink. The Sussex Pledge of May 1916, in which Germany promised to stop attacking passenger ships without warning, had provided temporary relief. But Wilson knew that promise had just been broken with the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. Now he held evidence that Germany was actively plotting to turn America's neighbors into enemies, to dismember American territory and return it to foreign control. The question was what to do with this information. Wilson's cabinet debated the telegram's release. Some urged caution, fearing it might be a British forgery. Others worried about revealing intelligence sources. But as reports of sunken American ships accumulated, as the death toll from submarine attacks climbed, the pressure to act intensified. On February 28th, Wilson authorized the telegram's publication. The following day, newspapers across America printed the decoded text under screaming headlines. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Act 2. A Nation Transformed. The words appeared in the Evening Star in Washington, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the San Francisco Chronicle, and hundreds of other papers from coast to coast. Americans read them over breakfast, coffee, and evening whiskey, in city offices and rural farmhouses, and struggled to process their meaning. The German Foreign Secretary had proposed that Mexico invade the United States. Germany offered to help Mexico reconquer territory that had been American for 70 years. 3 states with a combined population of nearly 5 million people would be handed to a foreign power as payment for attacking their own country. The audacity of it stunned even those Americans who had been sympathetic to Germany. German Americans, who had worked so hard to maintain neutrality and prevent anti-German prejudice, felt betrayed by their ancestral homeland. Irish Americans, who had opposed any alliance with Britain, found their position suddenly untenable. How could they oppose helping Britain when Germany was plotting to invade America itself? Isolationists, who had argued that the war was purely European, faced an undeniable fact: Germany had made the war American by its own actions. The debate over intervention did not end immediately, but it tilted decisively toward war. The German reaction to the telegram's publication proved almost as damaging as the telegram itself. Rather than deny the message outright, German officials equivocated. Some claimed it was a forgery. Others said that if genuine, it was merely a contingency plan, nothing to be taken seriously. The confusion stemmed from poor coordination and genuine shock that their secure communications had been compromised. Then, on March 3, 1917, Arthur Zimmermann made the most catastrophic diplomatic statement of the war. In a speech to the Reichstag, he admitted that the telegram was genuine. He explained it as a defensive measure, an insurance policy in case the United States entered the war. He seemed genuinely baffled by American outrage. In his view, he had simply been doing his job, exploring ways to protect German interests. He could not grasp that Americans might see the offer to dismember their country as something other than pragmatic diplomacy. Zimmermann's admission eliminated any remaining doubt about the telegram's authenticity. It silenced those who claimed British forgery, and it demonstrated to Americans that German leadership was so disconnected from reality that they could not even recognize when they had committed a catastrophic blunder. The admission did more to bring America into the war than months of British propaganda or submarine attacks. It was a self-inflicted wound of historic proportions. Behind the public outrage, intelligence officials marveled at German incompetence. The Germans had trusted a code that was 3 years obsolete. They had sent the most sensitive possible diplomatic communication through channels they knew were vulnerable. They had assumed the United States would never learn of the telegram, even as they transmitted it across wires and cables that touched Allied territory. And when confronted with the intercepted message, they had confirmed its authenticity rather than maintaining plausible deniability. Each error compounded the previous one, creating a cascade of failure that even a competent damage control effort could not contain. The telegram's impact rippled through American society in ways both obvious and subtle. Recruiting offices saw an uptick in volunteers before war was even declared. Newspapers that had urged neutrality switched their editorial positions. Religious leaders who had preached pacifism found their congregations demanding a more militant response. The shift in public opinion did not happen overnight, but it happened fast enough to transform the political landscape. Wilson, who had won re-election by keeping America out of war, now found himself with both the political cover and the moral justification to take the country in. On March 20, 1917, Wilson called his cabinet together to discuss the German threat. Every member present advised that war was now inevitable. The submarine campaign alone might have been enough, but combined with the Zimmermann telegram, neutrality had become impossible to maintain. Wilson authorized the arming of American merchant ships and called Congress into special session. On the evening of April 2, 1917, he stood before a joint session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war. The speech lasted 36 minutes. Wilson detailed Germany's submarine warfare, its violation of international law, its attacks on American lives and property. But when he spoke of the Zimmermann telegram, his voice took on a harder edge. Germany had sought to stir up enemies against the United States on its own borders. Germany had treated American sovereignty as a bargaining chip to be traded away. Germany had demonstrated that it viewed the United States not as a potential neutral but as an eventual enemy to be undermined and weakened. The world, Wilson declared, must be made safe for democracy. On April 4, The Senate voted 82-6 in favor of war. On April 6, the House of Representatives followed, voting 373-50. The United States was going to war. The mobilization that followed staggered in its scale and speed. A nation of 92 million people, protected by an army of 133,000 men, began transforming itself into a military power that would ultimately put 4 million men under arms. The Selective Service Act of May 1917 required all men between 21 and 30 to register for military service. By the end of the war, 24 million men had registered, and 2.8 million had been drafted. Industrial production shifted toward military needs. Factories that had made automobiles began producing tanks and trucks. Shipyards launched vessels at a pace that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Farms increased production to feed not just America but also the Allied armies in Europe. The American Expeditionary Forces began arriving in France in June 1917. General John Pershing, the same officer who had failed to catch Pancho Villa in Mexico, now commanded an army that would grow to 2 million men in Europe by the war's end. The first American troops saw combat in October 1917. They were green, inexperienced, and learned hard lessons in blood. But they kept coming. Ship after ship, convoy after convoy, they crossed an Atlantic that German submarines could no longer control. By the spring of 1918, American soldiers were arriving at a rate of 10,000 per day. The impact on German strategy was catastrophic. Germany's gamble on unrestricted submarine warfare had failed. Rather than starving Britain into submission in 5 months, the submarine campaign had brought a giant into the war. The submarines continued to sink ships, but not at a rate that matched the devastating pace of new construction and the implementation of the convoy system. Meanwhile, fresh American divisions poured into France, offsetting German gains on the Eastern Front after Russia's collapse. The mathematics of attrition, which had briefly seemed to favor Germany, shifted inexorably toward the Allies. Germany tried to win the war before American power could fully manifest. In the spring of 1918, having transferred divisions from the collapsed Eastern Front, Germany launched a massive offensive in the West. The Ludendorff Offensive, named for the general who planned it, initially succeeded brilliantly. German forces broke through Allied lines and advanced farther than at any time since 1914. For a few weeks, it seemed Germany might win the war after all. But the offensive consumed Germany's reserves, and when it stalled, there was nothing left. American forces, now numbering over 1 million men in France, counterattacked. The Second Battle of the Marne in July 1918 marked the turning point. American troops fought alongside French forces to stop the German advance and then push it back. From that moment, Germany was retreating. The Zimmermann telegram's impact extended beyond the military sphere. Mexico never seriously considered accepting Germany's offer. President Venustiano Carranza, struggling to control his own country, had no capacity to invade the United States even if he had wanted to. But the revelation of German plotting poisoned German-Mexican relations for a generation and intensified American surveillance of its southern border. Japanese leaders, who might have been flattered by the invitation to join an anti-American alliance, instead saw it as evidence of German desperation and untrustworthiness. The telegram reinforced Japan's decision to remain nominally aligned with the Allies, though its own imperial ambitions would emerge as a different threat in the decades to come. For British intelligence, the telegram represented both triumph and near disaster. Room 40 had achieved its greatest success, bringing America into the war without fully revealing the extent of British code-breaking operations. But Germany responded by upgrading its codes and becoming far more cautious about communications security. The intelligence windfall that Britain had enjoyed for the war's first years diminished significantly. Hall and his team had played their ace and won the hand, but they had revealed more about their capabilities than they would have liked. The balance between using intelligence and protecting sources would haunt intelligence services through the next World War and beyond. Act 3. The Reckoning. By November 1918, Germany was collapsing. Its armies were in retreat. Its navy mutinied. Revolution spread through its cities. Austria-Hungary had disintegrated. The Ottoman Empire surrendered. Bulgaria capitulated. Germany stood alone, its enemies closing in from all sides, its people starving, its government losing control. On November 11, 1918, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, German representatives signed an armistice. The guns fell silent at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, and the Great War ended. The final accounting was almost incomprehensible. Between 9 million and 11 million soldiers dead. Perhaps as many as 8 million civilians killed directly by the war. Millions more dead from disease, starvation, and the influenza pandemic that the war's conditions had helped spread. Empires destroyed. Economies shattered. A generation scarred physically and psychologically. And for what? The question would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. American casualties, though substantial by American standards, were relatively modest compared to the European powers. 116,516 American military personnel died, about 53,402 in combat, and the rest from disease and other causes. 204,000 were wounded. These numbers seem almost small against the millions lost by France, Germany, Russia, and Britain. But they represented an entire generation of young American men who would never come home, never marry, never have children, never live the lives they had imagined. Their sacrifice brought Germany's defeat and helped shape the post-war world in ways both profound and tragic. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, attempted to create a stable post-war order, but instead planted the seeds of future conflict. Germany was stripped of territory, forbidden from maintaining a significant military, and burdened with reparations that its economy could not possibly pay. The treaty's architects hoped to prevent future German aggression. Instead, they created conditions that bred resentment, economic chaos, and eventually the rise of an even more dangerous German regime. Arthur Zimmermann did not live to see the consequences of his telegram fully unfold. He resigned as Foreign Secretary in August 1917, his reputation destroyed by the scandal his admission had created. He spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity, working in business and occasionally commenting on foreign affairs. He died in June 1940, just as Germany began the conquest of France in a new war, the second act of a tragedy his telegram had helped to initiate. In his final years, he maintained that his telegram had been a reasonable response to an impossible situation. He never acknowledged that it was perhaps the single most counterproductive diplomatic communication in history. Captain Reginald Hall became one of the most celebrated intelligence officers in British history. After the war, he entered politics, serving as a Member of Parliament and continuing to influence intelligence matters. He never publicly revealed the full extent of Room 40's operations, protecting sources and methods even in his memoirs. He died in October 1943, as another generation fought another German enemy. His legacy lived on in the institutions and techniques that evolved from the work he pioneered. President Woodrow Wilson achieved his goal of making the world safe for democracy, but at a cost he could not have anticipated. He threw himself into creating the League of Nations, an international organization designed to prevent future wars through collective security. But the American Senate, reverting to isolationist instincts after the war, refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or join the League. Wilson suffered a severe stroke in October 1919 while campaigning for the treaty's ratification. He spent his remaining years partially paralyzed, watching as the peace he had worked to create unraveled. He died in February 1924, disappointed and disillusioned. For the United States, the war marked a fundamental transformation. The nation that had entered the conflict with a tiny army and a reluctance to engage with European affairs emerged as a global power. American economic strength, already significant before the war, now dominated the world economy. American military power, proven in the crucible of European combat, could no longer be ignored. American diplomatic influence, exercised through Wilson's 14 points and the Versailles negotiations, shaped the post-war settlement despite the Senate's ultimate rejection of the treaty. The United States had become what the Zimmermann telegram tried to prevent. It had become a decisive force in European and global affairs, a role it would struggle with but ultimately embrace over the coming decades. The telegram itself became a case study in intelligence operations, diplomatic failure, and the unintended consequences of secret plots. Military academies taught it as an example of how not to conduct covert operations. Diplomatic services studied it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of disconnection from reality. Historians analyzed it as a turning point, one of those moments when a single decision cascades into world-changing consequences. The telegram that was supposed to keep America out of the war by threatening it with invasion instead brought America in by revealing the threat. The cipher that was supposed to be unbreakable was broken. The secret that was supposed to remain hidden became front-page news around the world. Every assumption proved false. Every calculation proved wrong. In Mexico City, in a cafe not far from where German diplomats had once plotted with Mexican officials, an old man sat in 1953 reading a newspaper article about the Zimmermann telegram's impact on the First World War. He had been a young clerk in the German embassy during those fevered days of early 1917. He remembered the excitement when the telegram arrived, the sense that Germany was about to pull off a masterstroke that would transform the war. He remembered the confusion when news of the telegram's exposure broke, the panic as officials tried to contain the damage, the bitter realization that they had been outplayed. "We thought we were so clever," he said to a companion, his Spanish heavily accented with German. "We thought we had a secret that would win us the war. Instead, we handed our enemies the weapon they needed to defeat us. The telegram that was supposed to save Germany destroyed it." He folded the newspaper and stared out at the street, where children played in the afternoon sun, innocent of the plots and schemes that had once swirled through these buildings. History is full of brilliant plans that collapse the moment they meet reality. The Zimmermann telegram was not even particularly brilliant. It was desperate, and desperation makes men stupid. The companion asked whether he had learned anything from the experience, whether there was some lesson that could be drawn from such a comprehensive failure. The old man considered the question for a long moment before responding. "I learned that secrets are fragile things. No code is truly unbreakable. No plot is truly secure. The moment you commit something to paper, to wire, to any medium that can be captured and preserved, you risk exposure. But more than that, I learned that you cannot base strategy on what you wish to be true. Germany wished that Mexico would be willing and able to attack the United States. We wished that Japan would betray its allies for a chance at American territory. We wished that unrestricted submarine warfare would win the war before America could respond. We wished that Britain had not broken our codes. We built an entire strategy on wishes and called it a plan." He picked up his coffee, now cold, and took a sip anyway. The telegram revealed more than Germany's plot against America. It revealed Germany's fundamental misunderstanding of the world it was trying to reshape. We thought nations acted on simple calculations of self-interest. We thought alliances could be bought with promises of territory. We thought that intimidation would keep America neutral even as we gave them every reason to join our enemies. We were so focused on the tactics of winning the war that we lost sight of the reality of the world we were actually fighting in. The companion pressed further. Surely there were circumstances where such bold action might have succeeded. Surely some version of the plan could have worked. The old man shook his head slowly, definitively. "No, The telegram could never have worked because it was based on fantasies. Mexico could barely control its own territory. Why would we think it could conquer American states? Japan was an allied power with no reason to betray that alliance for vague promises. Why would we think they would risk their position for a desperate German scheme? And America, far from being the divided, uncertain nation we imagined, was simply waiting for a clear reason to act. We gave them that reason. We did in one telegram what years of Allied propaganda could not do. We made Americans angry. The afternoon wore on. The cafe filled with other patrons. The old man finished his coffee and prepared to leave. But before he did, he offered one final observation, spoken so quietly that his companion had to lean in to hear it. The greatest intelligence failure is not having your codes broken. It is believing that you understand your enemy when you do not. Britain knew us better than we knew ourselves. They knew that if they gave us enough rope, we would hang ourselves. And we did. The Zimmermann telegram was the rope we wove with our own hands. He stood, adjusted his hat, and walked out into the Mexico City sunshine, leaving his companion to ponder words that carried the weight of experience bought with empires and millions of lives. Decades later, historians would continue to debate the Zimmermann telegram's place in the constellation of causes that brought America into the First World War. Some would argue that American entry was inevitable, that the submarine campaign alone would have forced Wilson's hand eventually. Others would claim that without the telegram, isolationist sentiment might have kept America out despite the sinking ships and lost lives. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes, as truth often does. What remains undeniable is that the telegram accelerated American entry and shaped the narrative around it. Americans went to war not just because their ships were being sunk, but because their sovereignty had been threatened, their territory offered up as payment in a foreign conspiracy. The distinction mattered. It transformed the war from a European quarrel that happened to impact American commerce into an existential threat to American security. It made intervention not just justified, but necessary. In the archives of the National Security Agency at Fort Meade, Maryland, in a climate-controlled vault protected by multiple layers of security, a copy of the Zimmermann telegram rests among other historically significant intercepted communications. Students of cryptanalysis sometimes examine it, not for its content, which is well known, but for what it represents. It is a reminder that intelligence work is not just about breaking codes or stealing secrets. It is about understanding how information can be weaponized, how revelation can be timed for maximum impact, how a single intercepted message can change the course of history when presented at the right moment in the right way. Captain Hall understood this. He sat on the telegram for weeks, not because he doubted its value, but because he knew that value depended on context and timing. Released too early, it might have seemed like a forgery. Released without corroboration, it might have been dismissed. Released without the pressure of submarine attacks to prime American opinion, it might not have had sufficient impact. Hall waited until all the elements aligned, then delivered the telegram at the moment of maximum effect. His patience, his cunning, his understanding of how information moves through political systems turned an intercepted message into a war-winning weapon. The telegram also stands as a monument to the dangers of technological overconfidence. Germany's Foreign Office believed their codes were secure because they were mathematically complex. They failed to account for human factors, for the codebooks that might be captured, for the traffic analysis that could reveal patterns, for the determined cryptanalysts who would spend thousands of hours searching for vulnerabilities. They confused difficulty with impossibility and paid the price for that confusion. Modern intelligence services study the Zimmermann telegram for these lessons. They note how Germany's multi-route transmission strategy, meant to ensure the message reached its destination, instead provided multiple opportunities for interception. They observe how the re-encryption in Washington using an older code created the very vulnerability Germany had tried to avoid. They analyze Zimmermann's admission of authenticity as perhaps the worst possible response to a security breach. And they learn, or try to learn, that in intelligence work, the greatest victories often come from exploiting the enemy's mistakes rather than from one's own brilliance. On a wall in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., visitors can see a reproduction of the Zimmermann telegram alongside other artifacts from America's wars. Children on school field trips pause before it, reading the decoded text while their teachers explain what it meant, why it mattered. The children struggle to grasp how words on a page could lead to war, how a diplomatic message could carry such weight. Their teachers do their best to convey the context, the accumulation of grievances, the way the telegram became the final catalyst in a chain reaction that had been building for years. But perhaps the telegram's deepest significance lies not in what it did, but in what it revealed about the world of 1917. It revealed a world where empires still thought they could trade territories like poker chips, where racial and national hierarchies were assumed to be natural and permanent, where war was seen as a legitimate tool of policy, where millions could be sent to die for abstract concepts of honor and prestige. The telegram emerged from that world and helped to destroy it. The war it helped to trigger shattered the old order so completely that the world that emerged afterward would have been almost unrecognizable to the diplomats who drafted that fateful message. Arthur Zimmermann wrote his telegram in a world of emperors and empires. By the time the war ended, 3 empires had collapsed completely, and others were mortally wounded. He wrote it in a world where European powers dominated global affairs. By the time the peace treaties were signed, America and eventually the Soviet Union were ascending to superpower status. He wrote it in a world where wars were fought by professional armies while civilians watched. The war that followed killed so many civilians that the distinction between soldier and civilian began to blur in ways that would become even more horrific in the next World War. The telegram, then, is more than a historical curiosity or an intelligence case study. It is a marker of transition, a point where one world ended and another began. The methods it represents, the assumptions it embodied, the strategies it attempted, all belonged to a dying era. Its failure was not just Germany's failure, but the failure of an entire way of thinking about power, security, and international relations. In the end, the Zimmermann telegram accomplished the opposite of everything it intended. It was meant to deter American entry into the war, but instead provoked it. It was meant to divide American opinion, but instead united it. It was meant to distract American military power, but instead focused it. It was meant to remain secret, but instead became headline news. It was meant to help Germany, but instead helped to ensure Germany's defeat. In every particular, it failed. And in failing, it changed the world. The 3 men who hunched over that desk in room 40 on January 17, 1917, could not have known the full consequences of what they had intercepted. They knew they held something important, something that might shift the balance of the war, but they could not know that the message would still be studied and debated more than a century later, that it would become synonymous with diplomatic disaster and intelligence triumph, that it would mark a turning point not just in a war but in the history of 2 continents. Captain Hall, reading those decoded words for the first time, saw an opportunity. History would reveal that he had actually intercepted a confession, Germany's admission that it no longer believed it could win the war through military means and was resorting to desperate gambits born of fear rather than strength. The Zimmermann telegram was the sound of an empire in its death throes, lashing out at imagined enemies, grasping at implausible alliances, mistaking activity for strategy. And like so many dying things, it did not go quietly. It thrashed, it plotted, it schemed, and in doing so, it accelerated its own destruction. The light faded in room 40 as the 3 men continued their work. Outside, London went about its wartime routine, unaware that in that small office the fate of nations had just shifted. Ships crossed the Atlantic. Soldiers died in trenches. Diplomats drafted notes. And somewhere in Mexico, German diplomats prepared to receive a message that would define their failure and shape the world for generations to come. History had turned, though few yet realized it. The telegram had been sent. The code had been broken. The trap had been set. All that remained was the springing of it and the long, bloody aftermath that would follow.